Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host and my own host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Saturday, 11 July, 2026 years after Jesus. We're back celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States of America with continuing our discussion on executive power as presented in The Creation of the Presidency, 1775 to 1789, a study in constitutional history by Charles C. Thach, Jr., made available by Liberty Fund Press, Liberty Fund in Indianapolis, Indiana. Check them out. This is a wonderful volume, and we're so grateful that they have made this available. We'd like to thank Charles C. Thach Jr. for writing it. And we left off in our discussion of national executive power under the Articles of Confederation. Recall, we didn't have very much longer to go in the chapter, so we're going to be getting into the next chapter on the Federal Constitutional Convention. For anybody that's going to whine about how 11 July is after 4 July and the 250th anniversary is over and blah, 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 blah. Well, we're getting into the federal convention debates about the presidency. And since we're getting into the federal convention debates about the presidency, don't you think it would be a good idea? Don't you think? Since that's coming up in September, Constitution Day, to continue our reflection, not to leave it out there unresolved, this issue of executive power in America. What do we do with executive power? We don't have a king. Do we have the legislature do executive power? How's that going to work? Is that going to work okay? We saw that there was some experimentation there under the articles. There's some lessons that were learned from the state executive experience under those constitutions. So, what about that at the federal level? What did the Federal Constitutional Convention learn about executive power per se that made its way into the Constitution, which is an enduring document that informs our national life today, And so this is the discussion that we're having. We left off on the top of page 61 with Jefferson's horrible idea of a committee of states, and we left that idea dangling there. And so we're going to get back into it. We're going to make a fair use of this, do a transformative reading of it. Go out and get your copy today of The Creation of the Presidency, 1775 to 1789, a study in constitutional history by Charles C. Thach Jr. Well, I'm ready. How about you? Let's um, let's have a little chaplain's corner and open with a word of prayer. What do you say? Heavenly Father, we thank you for what you've done in our country. We thank you, Lord, for the provision that you've made for us to have a place to grow and learn, to live and move and have our being, to be a blessing to those around us instead of a burden and a hindrance, for the lessons that we've learned as a people. May our memory not grow dim. Holy Spirit, enliven us, convict us of sin. A lot of people don't like that language of conviction. Regenerate us, Lord, from the inside out. Lead us to repentance where appropriate. Help us heal from our many afflictions. Help us love you and our neighbor. Help us to flourish. Help us to continue to grow into flourishing, and help us remember, Lord, that this is not our final destination. This is not the summum bonum. This is not the end all be all. But there is a future for the people of God. There is a future for those who are outside the people of God. May we be mindful of that so that we bring people into a salvation where we can, Lord, where we can be sensitive to the promptings of your Spirit and your work in the people to bring people to saving faith. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, see if my coffee is still warm. Hmm. Still warm. Great. Page 61 at the top, Jefferson's idea of a committee of states. The last sentence of that top paragraph was accordingly, governmental experience. Well, nothing, in fact, was suggested along these lines except for Jefferson's proposed committee of states. Along what lines? The question of an independent executive department could hardly be raised under the existing frame of government. Page 60 at bottom, page 61 at the top. In fact, nothing, in fact, was suggested along these lines. That is, an independent executive department, except Jefferson's proposed committee of states. What's the theme here? The theme is executive is unitary. Committee of states is not unitary. It's many. It's a committee. There's always this drift toward a committee. Let's have a committee. Committee. Accordingly, governmental experience, except for this, failed to suggest a solution of the complex question of a distribution of functions into the two classes, legislative and executive. Legislative partakes of the many, the committee, the board, right? But executive is different. Executive is different. This experience of Jefferson is of interest, first because of its failure. It was a final blow, if one were needed, to executive plurality. Executive plurality. It was a final blow, if one were needed, to executive plurality. Put that on a coffee mug, put that on a calendar. The experience of the committee was ludicrous in the extreme, says Thach. The New England delegates became angered because the Southerners desired to adjourn over Saturdays for the benefit of their health and because they may not have been accustomed to do business on that day. Or, the irate Massachusetts writer adds, any other day. One member in the course of a debate, quote, rose and hallooed as though he might be heard through town, unquote. Another told the secretary to enter a certain resolution. Another told the secretary to enter a certain resolution, quote, at his peril, unquote. uh, the upshot was that two members left, breaking the quorum, lamenting as they went that, quote, such men as their opponents are unfit to govern this country, unquote. In charity, it, be it said that it is reported that the heat was intense. Oh yeah. Oh, I'm sure, Thach. I like that detail. Good job, Thach. Yeah. Yeah. Um, sometimes that's all it takes to explain something that happened in history is just remember there's no air conditioning. Um, I'm laughing at some guy telling the secretary, enter that resolution at your peril. Um, uh, they're trying to do executive business, and it's a bunch of them, and they each have their own mind. And some of them walk out, and they don't have a quorum. And then you have it's common to have a secretary, right? And the secretary's job is uh, should be a clerk in a sense that you keep records, right? That's a pretty important job. The records of the votes. You think that that's a kind of important job, the records of the minutes, right? They don't, you don't have time to write everything, right? James Madison, this is not about the Constitutional Convention, but James Madison kept very careful notes about the Constitutional Convention, which were published after his death, which is why we know, or at least take ourselves to know, how that went. Because the official record of the secretary, James Madison was not the secretary. Nevertheless, this is a general thing. Sometimes it's not the secretary that knows a lot that keeps the records that really matter. But James Madison was not the secretary of the convention. It was somebody else, and those records were published, but um, they're not. I mean, you can compare them to Madison's notes, but Madison's notes that were published after his death were a gold mine of information about how that whole thing went, as we're going to see. And so the secretary's job is to enter a resolution and then sign his name and date it, right? Well, there's all sorts of nefarious things that could happen. What if the secretary doesn't agree with the resolution, and maybe misstates it? Um, does the secretary himself have a vote on the resolution? Usually, yes. Usually, yes. It's not simply a court reporter like we have in a courtroom, but this is a participant in the vote. The secretary is usually a corporate officer in the sense of a participating in the vote as well, so that they might be defeated in something they preferred to happen, but didn't happen. Now, I just thought that was funny. That's why I was laughing. So apparently there was a disagreement about what was really decided or what should be decided. And the issue of quorum in parliamentary law is very important as well. Um, so if you've never studied any parliamentary law, it's not really fashionable to really think about it carefully anymore. It used to be um, there used to be more common knowledge about what parliamentary law was. Of course, it comes from parliament, parliamentary supremacy, legislative supremacy that the colonists were accustomed to and familiar with. It's an Anglophilic thing because parliament is an Anglophilic thing developed in England, right? It's part of the common law tradition to have recognition of these kinds of procedures for any kind of a corporate body, private or public, making decisions by corporate resolution or a committee of some kind. Um, and there's a book I wanted to show you. I'm going to go get this book. I'll be right back because I think it's important to talk about this. I'll be right back. I found it pretty quickly. I have kind of an extensive library, and I was able to find this. This is a woman's manual on parliamentary law, published over 100 years ago, this volume. It's a lovely volume, and it's written by Harriet R. Shattuck, president of the Boston political class, and it's got illustrations with practical illustrations, especially adapted to women's organizations. And the copyright is 1895. And this volume is in a perfect condition. This volume is from 1895. It's crazy. This is great though, but it's something that would be used by what we call a nonprofit organization. And I've had this for a long time. I used to read this at night. I know it sounds kind of strange, but you know, she talks about the election of officers. She talks about what the officers do, uh, the Constitution and the bylaws. This is really good. It's really good stuff. The what one thing you might be interested in is this is a woman's manual on parliamentary law by Harriet R. Shattuck, and the first thing you do is you elect a chairman. A chairman. Yeah. They had no problem with the word chairman because of the word man was gender neutral. Um, and then you got, okay, so let's talk about the table of contents. So, first of all, you have organization. Who is the organization? Then you have motions, the making of motions, voting, debate, reconsideration, withdrawal, um, amendment, um, precedence, um, privilege, and order. You got, oh, sorry. Okay. Quorum, the issue of permanence, right? The issue of permanence is an interesting thing because I've had a lot of experience as a corporate officer and church experience, nonprofit work, of course, for a house of worship, and um, we had an issue where one of the corporate officers didn't seem to understand that the body that we were on called a vestry, and she's no longer on it, but the vestry was a permanent body. It didn't pop into existence and out of existence. It was a permanent board that made decisions, and you were supposed to take it seriously according to your responsibilities that you have as a member of this body that makes decisions for the organization. And so I mean, I've had experience where you're trying to run a church and the the people that take themselves to be in charge don't seem to understand that the corporation requires a continuing board. It's not just her or some guy she likes or whatever. They used to work together or whatever, and they make all the decisions with total un, unrelated to what the board thinks or who the board is. And I got back into this last year or 2 years ago when we had some major decisions that we had to do, and there's some negotiations we had to do, and just to make sure I was doing things right and thinking about things right. And I was the only one at the church for a time that was taking this stuff seriously, and they didn't like it. The people at the church didn't like it. Well, it turned out I was right. Turned out I was correct that you really do have to take this stuff seriously. You can't just make it up and hope no one catches you because uh, we live in we live in, because of our context, we live in a country that was shaped by the revolutionary experience, that was shaped by the colonial experience, getting a lot of our law, our basic law, from the parliamentary system that we inherited. Um, a lot of the common law that was incorporated into our statutes. And now, uh, you might, it might be a little detail that people don't care about, like especially students, that um, these guys took that stuff seriously. The people that were at the Constitutional Convention took that very seriously. And that was in what, 1787. It got passed down to prominent ways of doing business even today. But this is a nice little snapshot in this little teeny volume, Women's Manual of Parliamentary Law, 1895, Boston. These girls were no joke, man. They were out for blood, dude. They were ready to rumble. They were ready to make it happen. Uh, they were probably on the cutting edge of a lot of the issues that came to a head in the early 1900s, like, for example, prohibition, which became law before the amendment to the U.S. Constitution guaranteeing the right to vote regardless of sex. It was women that were pushing for uh, making alcohol illegal. Um, and of course, that was reversed, thankfully. But but it's a part of our tradition, and it's a specimen. Librarians call this a specimen. It's a sample, you might say. It's a snapshot into the way things were thought about, and they still are thought about that in that way. And they're worth taking seriously. The issue that Thach is getting into here is that this common way of making decisions for private or public uh, corporations was very natural to think we can do everything through parliamentary law, everything, including executive business. And he's giving this example of Jefferson's Committee of States. And remember, he says, this experience of Jefferson's is of interest first because of its failure. Its failure. It was a final blow, if one were needed, to executive plurality, not legislative plurality, but executive plurality. Um, and of course, you have the thing that I was laughing about, the threat to the secretary and stuff. So, I mean, if you study this, you know what a secretary is, and you know that that kind of a threat would, there's nothing in here. I've looked at this women's manual of parliamentary law. There's nothing in there about how to deal with a threat to the secretary. They don't cover that in parliamentary law for organizations. But that's the real stuff of trying to execute business by that model. And that's why I was laughing, is because some of the most practical things you're not going to get any help with. Now, back to Thach. Um, Remember, he blames it on the heat. But the great, the great, the greater interest lies in the causes that led Jefferson to insist upon it. Yeah. And especially in the catalog of executive duties with which he felt it desirable to endow the committee. Remember, this failed. Um, these reasons were fully expressed in the following letter written, it should be noted, prior to the rising of the Federal Convention. Here's a block quote. Quote, I think it very material to separate in the hands of Congress the executive and legislative powers. Okay. I'll finish the sentence and I'll come back. As the judiciary already are in some degree. This, I hope, will be done. I think it very material to separate in the hands of Congress the executive and legislative powers. Do you notice anything? He still has both in Congress, and Congress is legislative. So he still has not separated the executive power out of Congress. Did you catch that? Okay. The want of it has been the source of more evil than we have experienced from any other cause. Nothing is so embarrassing as the details of execution. My gosh, that is so good. As a corporate officer at a church that's had to deal with this, um, man, as an executive at the church, also on the board, what we call the vestry, mm, people don't like details. Execution requires details. It, getting something done requires details, especially if you're digging yourself out of a pit from the prior executive that left all of a sudden and is gone, and those details are gone with that guy, and you got to recreate all that stuff, which was my job for a while. And I tried sharing it with some people. Man, they did not like details. The details oftentimes are the key to executive success. Legislature. Okay, so let's continue the quote here with Jefferson. I think it very material to separate in the hands of Congress the executive and legislative powers as the judiciary are already are in some degree. But remember, he says in the hands of Congress, which is the fundamental problem right there. I hope this will be done. The want of it has been the source of more evil than we have experienced from any other cause. This is Thomas Jefferson saying this. Nothing is so embarrassing as the details of execution. The smallest trifle of that kind occupies as long as the most important act of legislation and takes place of everything else. Let any man recollect or look over the files of Congress, he will observe the most important propositions hanging over from week to week and month to month till the occasion have passed them and the thing never done. I have ever viewed the executive details as the greatest cause of evil. Page 62 at the top, to us, because they, in fact, place us as if we had no federal head by diverting the attention of that head from the great to small objects. And should this division of power not be recommended by the convention, it is my opinion Congress should make it itself by establishing an executive committee. That's Jefferson to Carrington, August 4th, 1787. Hmm. Okay. Um, there's one thing I'm puzzling about. Maybe somebody at Liberty Fund can help me with this. The citation is August 4th, 1787, but in setting up the quotation, Thach says that it should be noted in the following letter pr prior to the rising of the Federal Convention, but that was during the Federal Convention. Okay. I don't know what he meant by that, but that's a problem. This from a man, this is what Thach says, the end of the quote there from Jefferson, page 62. This from the man who, under the influence of intense indignation at the abuses of the old regime in France, was at practically the same time condoning the Shays men of Massachusetts. This from the man who, under the influence of intense indignation at the abuses of the old regime in France, was at practically the same time condoning the Shays men of Massachusetts, was a concession of significance. It shows that in national as well as state government, a separate executive department was demanded by the exigencies of efficient government. So these are the lessons. A separate executive department was demanded by the exigencies of efficient government until it became a foregone conclusion that any new scheme of government would include such an organ. The degree of power with which Jefferson wished to endow the committee is worthy of special notice, Thach says. By Article by Article 10 of the Articles, national powers requiring the vote of 9 states could not be exercised by the committee, but all others might be vested in it by Congress. These prohibited powers included the making of war, the granting of letters of marque, the making of treaties or alliances, coining money or regulating its value, ascertaining sums necessary for welfare or defense, emitting bills, borrowing money, appropriating money, agreeing on the number of land or sea forces or of war vessels, or appointing a commander in chief. To these prohibitions, Jefferson would have added the sending and receiving ambassadors, the establishment of rules of decision in cases of capture, or the establishment of courts of appeal for their trial and determination of interstate disputes and the fixing of standards. These are all very important functions. The question is who's going to do them and how is it going to be set up? Positively, Thach continues, bottom of page 62, however, he, remember it's Jefferson, he would give to this body, this is the Committee of States still we're on, quote, for conducting the business of the United States, unquote, the following important functions. Okay. Determination of specific private claims to soil under the general rule, regulation of Indian trade and management of Indian affairs, regulation of the post office, appointment of military officers, save the commander-in-chief and regimental officers, and of all naval officers, commissioning all officers, making rules and regulations for the military forces, subject to the Congressional Article of War, the building, buying, and equipping of ships decided on by Congress, the actual making of requisitions, superintending all officers appertaining to the United States, directing and controlling the application of money in the detail according to the general appropriation previously made by Congress, making recess appointments, executing in general the resolutions, orders, and ordinances of Congress, and calling extra sessions, all, of course, subject to the law. That's all. That's all. There's a lot there. All very important, all which found their way one way or another into the Constitution, the constitutional system that we have. Page 63 at the top, it is impossible to say whether Jefferson would have gone farther had it been constitutionally possible. But it should be noted that the trend of national development was toward a superintending administrative agency standing between the departments and Congress. That would have been a disaster. Evidently, the frequent assertion that administration in the modern sense was not considered an executive function is incorrect. The impetus for a separate executive, so far as national affairs was concerned, was furnished primarily by the desire to free Congress from the necessity of concerning itself with the details of administrative business. Yeah, execution is about details. The strictly administrative phase of congressional action was, of course, not the whole of it. It exercised the great non-legislative powers of appointment, of determining financial policy, and of control of foreign affairs as well. Its incapacity in all three lines of endeavor is too well known to require demonstration. Wow. Yeah. Its incapacity in all three lines of endeavor is too well known to require demonstration. Factional differences kept important officers unfilled, important offices unfilled for long periods. Time and again, purely personal considerations proved the governing factor in determination of foreign policy. What could possibly go wrong? Let's take a look at footnote 55. Um, I'm still looking at this. Hold on a sec. It's about Alexander Hamilton. It's good. It's good. I'm going to skip it though. You can take a look at it. The laborious efforts to draft instructions for the negotiators of the Treaty of Peace with the accompanying intrigues of the French faction against the English faction served to prove Congress as incompetent in this capacity, as in its strictly administrative character. By 1787, it was a thoroughly discredited body, page 64 at the top. By 1787, it was a thoroughly discredited body. Hmm. Thus, in many ways, national experience duplicated the teachings of state experience. Key issue right there. We find the same conclusions that executive efficiency and responsibility vary inversely in proportion to the size of the executive body. I'm going to read that again. Probably the most important sentence in this entire chapter. Chapter 3, national executive power under this is under the articles. We find the same conclusions that executive efficiency and responsibility vary inversely in proportion to the size of the executive body. That the power to appoint and remove subordinates is essential to control and responsibility on the part of the real head. That military efficiency is directly dependent on unification of command. That a legislative body should not concern itself with the details of administration. That's very good. The adoption of the principle of separation of powers, as interpreted to mean the exercise of different functions of government by department officers. Excuse me. The adoption of the principle of separation of powers, as interpreted to mean the exercise of different functions of government by departments officered by entirely different individuals, also seems insistently demanded as a sine qua non of governmental efficiency. It seemed, indeed, the only way to secure that functional distribution, that wresting of non-legislative powers from a body that ought to be entirely legislative, which was so greatly desired. It gave point and meaning to the statements of the two theorists whose influence was so great, Blackstone and Montesquieu, that confusion of powers in the same hands was tyranny. And yet, there is a real difference between the solutions toward which the two kinds of experiences seem to point. In national affairs, the separate executive, so far as one had evolved, had come into being under the law. National executive power was inherently and unavoidably subordinate to the legislative. Yeah, that's a problem that the Constitutional Convention had to fix. But Thach is showing you why they came to believe they had to fix it. Uh, Executive organs depended for the determination of their powers on the law. They were strictly the creation of the creatures of the law. The next step in order after the creation of Jefferson's committee, had it been possible to take it, would have been the creation of a committee of one, which still would have acted under Congress. In short, the tendency in the national field was more toward separation than equality. It remained to be seen how the new frame of government would settle the matter, how particularly it would work out the relations of the existing departments, creatures of the law, to the executive chief. Many characteristics of the new executive were predetermined, but not this, the most vital of all. Okay, that's the end of that chapter at the bottom of page 64. At the top of page 65, it's chapter 4, the presidency in the federal constitution. Now we're getting to the solution to all these problems, the presidency. Having established, this is the beginning of the next chapter, page 65. Having established the fact that the political psychology of the men who framed the federal constitution was by no means characterized by that jealousy of the executive which was so prevalent in 1776, and that indeed the pendulum of conservative opinion had swung so far in the opposite direction that the people's representatives had become the chief opponent, the chief object, of its dislike. And having seen that the desirability of certain principles of executive organization had been deeply impressed on the conservative mind by actual experience with government, it will be well to attempt to visualize the problem of national executive power as it appeared to the delegates in 1787. Mm. So his thesis here that he states here is having established the fact that the political psychology of the men who framed the Federal Convention was by no means characterized by that jealousy of the executive, which was so prevalent in 1776. In other words, the reaction against executive tyranny under the king and parliamentary supremacy under Parliament, both kinds of abuses produced July 4th, 1776. But they had moved on from that to now realize by 1787, we don't really know what we're doing. We need an executive. We thought we could get away with not having one, but we need one. In the largest sense of the term, Thach continues, it appeared the chief and the most difficult problem to be solved. The fundamental defect of the existing national government was lack of power, not lack of functions. As Publius claimed in Federalist 45, it, quote, if the new Constitution be examined with accuracy and candor, it will be found that the change which it proposes consists much less in the additions of new powers to the Union than in the invigoration of original powers, unquote. Even the vesting of the national organization with the taxing power was but a substitution of new means for old. The field of commerce was indeed almost the only completely new function that the national government would acquire. Only that, only that, only that. This, with the important prohibitions on the states, was the only substantive change to be made. The rest was a matter of machinery. The Federal Convention did its work much in the same spirit of, for example, those British parliaments, which by now, by slow degrees, perfected the mechanical device of habeas corpus, page 66 at the top. The most far-reaching of these mechanistic changes was the substitution of direct action of the national government on the individual for the existing method. It required no peculiar clairvoyance to perceive that this meant the substitution of national executive officers and national courts for those of the states in exactly the proportion that nationalism was achieved. The executive problem was thus primarily one of law enforcement, the institution of a department well enough equipped with power to see to it that the laws were faithfully executed in distant Georgia and individualistic Western Pennsylvania and Western Massachusetts, as well as in the commercial centers of the seaboard. When the extent of the territory for which the new government was to make laws is considered, multiplied many times as it was by poor transportation facilities, the problem takes on an almost the character of a problem of imperial administration. Well, of course, of course. Theorists were as one in confining feeble democratic government to small areas in view of the superior executive efficiency of governments containing a large proportion of executive irresponsibility and the universal belief that a Republican executive, yeah, was inherently weak. The delegates' chief concern was thus to secure an executive strong enough, not one weak enough. I'm going to say that again. The delegates' chief concern was thus to secure an executive strong enough, not one weak enough. To do this, they believed, and rightly, was peculiarly difficult and complex. That's right. That's right. Yeah. The fact that certain principles of executive organization had become fixed in the conservative mind did not, it may well be repeated. We're going to page 67 at the top now. Predetermine the nature of the national executive. Not only were there the two separate lines of development in state and national experience, state and the nation, respectively, with a fundamental difference between them on an all important point, but there were delegates at Philadelphia who had not undergone the whole of the conservative reaction. It will be remembered that in introducing the discussion of the general tendencies of conservative thought, a caveat was entered against interpreting general opinion as unanimous opinion. While the opinion of the class as a whole was under consideration, minority opinion could be disregarded. But this is no longer true where the activities of a small group from this class are concerned. Then personal differences become of momentous importance. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is not very easy to differentiate the delegates into classes solely on the basis of their adherence to a strong executive or weak. There were other divisions, frequently more fundamental, whose lines cut across those which concern our investigation. Chief of these, Thach says, was that which separated the members into small state and large state groups. There was a far further division based on social and economic grounds between the North and the South, and especially between the North and the three southernmost states. In addition, a state might well have peculiar internal problems which influenced its attitude. Such, for example, was the case with South Carolina, where the conservatives controlled the state legislature, though outnumbered by the newcomers of the interior. The executive was wholly the product of no one of these influences, but rather of the checking of one interest by another, the counter-checking of each by a third. However, if strong executive be substituted for monarchy, the following analysis of Luther Martin, to be distinguished from Martin Luther, the reformer, the following analysis of Luther Martin, which, though a part of a campaign document, has the advantage of being from the pen of a participant, furnishes a fairly accurate description of the parties in the convention. There were three parties, he said. The first was that, quote, whose object and wish it was to abolish and annihilate all state governments and to bring forward one general government over this extensive continent of a monarchical nature under certain restrictions and limitations, unquote. Second, the second was not for the abolition of state governments, nor for the introduction of a monarchical government under any form, but they wished to establish such a system as could give their own states undue power and influence in the government over the other states, unquote. And the third, truly federal party, as Martin viewed the situation, quote, were for proceeding upon terms of federal equality. They were for taking our present federal system as the basis of their proceedings, unquote. So political parties, it's common for scholars to say political parties were not contemplated by the Constitution, and it's almost as if the impression you get is that they didn't exist. That's not quite true. That's actually not right. There were different parties. They did have different assumptions and thoughts and goals. So be careful there. After all, the defense of what was written and agreed to at the Constitutional Convention was defended by people who called themselves Federalists, which was just named one of the parties there that Luther Martin mentioned. And this was, well, it's in Farrand, Records of the Federal Convention, Madison's notes, volume 1, page 255, and volume 3, page 172, if you want to look up those notes that were referred to earlier. So, the third, the truly federal party, as Martin viewed the situation, were for proceeding upon terms of federal equality. They were for taking our present federal system as the basis of their proceedings. It was a coalition of the first two groups that carried the Constitution, he continued. The large state delegates with state sovereignty proclivities abandoning their state sovereignty ideas in return for the enhancement of large state power. Like most attempts at generalization, Martin's explanation is open to much and valid criticism. It contains, for present purposes, however, a sufficient approximation of the truth, says Thach. Nationalism and adherence to a strong executive did go hand in hand, as he said. Also, there were large state delegates with pronounced leanings towards state sovereignty and weak government. Where Martin was farthest afield was in lumping all the state delegates into a single class. At the time of the great crisis over representation, Dickinson told Madison, this is in the records that Madison kept of the Federal Convention of the Constitution, quote, you see the consequences of pushing things too far. Some of the members from the small states wish for two branches in the general legislature and are friends to a good national government, unquote. But he added equality of representation was the sine qua non for small state entrance into the Union. Gee, why would that be? Of course. Similarly, Charles Pinckney of the convention floor declared without contradiction, quote, the whole comes to this. Give New Jersey an equal vote, and she will dismiss her scruples and concur in the valid system, unquote. Thach continues, it was only because, on bottom page 68 now, it was only because enough of the small state representatives were, as Dickinson said, quote, friends to a good national government, unquote, that the executive department assumed its final shape. We shall see, though, that they demanded their quid pro quo before they would, quote, dismiss their scruples, unquote. Page 69 at the top. And that's enough for today. We've been going for about an hour. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. This has been a lovely time with you, enjoying our 250th anniversary of the United States of America. Uh, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well, reflecting on uh, the fact that there was a lot of work to do and it wasn't quite clear how that work was to be done. Um, so this is a Saturday, 11 July 2026, years after Jesus. Um, and happy birthday, United States of America. We still have a lot to do, and we're still learning a lot, hopefully. That's the whole point of doing this podcast, doing this work. We want to do it well. We want to do it carefully. I know a lot of people say that um, it's not the kind of thing that's for them, but that's why there's other things you can do with your time than listen to this podcast. This podcast is just a general, um, well, it's a record of my thoughts, but it's also just an invitation to come and learn what it means to think like a Republican professor in uh, in today's day and age. All right, take care. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time.